My name is Morris Williams, and it's my privilege to welcome you to the Free Library of Philadelphia for a wonderful evening with a fantastic speaker. Let me first ask you to please turn off your cell phones. A reminder of no flash photography. Be sure and buy Winter is Coming, and have the author sign it upstairs after his talk. He'll be signing the books, and I know that you will find it a fascinating journey. And since winter is really coming, the title he will give you has nothing to do with the weather. You have the information about Garry Kasparov in your bulletin, but let me just, as I like to do, add a few additional pieces of information. He was born in Baku, Azerbaijan. His father's last name was Weinstein, a Russian Jew. His mother was of Armenian background. His father died when Garry was 7, of leukemia. And at age 12, he adopted his mother's name and changed it to the Russianized Kasparov. As you probably know, he was involved early on in chess, and there was a pivotal moment, tournament I should say, at age 15, where he unexpectedly won the tournament and became a chess master, and he views that as a very pivotal moment in his life's journey. In 1990, Baku was full of violence against Armenians, and so he and his family fled to Moscow. So he has had a journey from the early days that has been challenged in terms of ethnic violence and ethnic prejudice. I want to read just a couple of quick passages from his book because I think they highlight some of the things that he believes in and stands for. And the first is, quote, "The Putin regime is and always has been about one thing, money." The second, quote, "It is not what a government does with data that defines that government. It is what it does to human beings." And finally, "I say that Russia remains my country, regardless of where I live or papers I carry." That's a reference to the fact that he has not been able to return to Russia since 2013, and he travels under a Croatian passport. But he is vigorously involved in the future of Russia and in the future of global diplomacy. Ladies and gentlemen, he will be interviewed by Dick Polman, who's a writer in residence at the University of Pennsylvania. But particularly for Garry Kasparov, please join me in giving him a wonderful Philadelphia welcome.
Welcome, everybody. Hope this is working okay. Everybody hear it? Yeah. I know you had many choices tonight between the World Series and the Republican debate. Who knows? Maybe in the Republican debate they'll talk a little bit about Russia tonight, but who knows, right?
No, tonight they talk about economy.
Right, the economy. But so what we're going to do here, I'm going to toss a few questions at Mr. Kasparov, and then for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes tops. And then we're going to open it up to the audience. And there'll be microphones when the time comes, where we want to make sure we finish up at the tidy time of 8:30, so we're going to do our best. I can just put this question very simply, having read the book, which I found to be provocative and not a little scary, as a matter of fact. The average person on the street, the average American on the street who doesn't follow foreign affairs closely, how much should the average citizen be concerned about Putin, in measurable ways in their lives?
America is the most globalized economy in the world, and you can't afford not to think about global security. And Putin, I believe, is the number one enemy because he has more power than all these Islamic states and Iranian mullahs combined. It's not just about nukes. It's about Russian military, and also I think it's the political power that Russia carries. You know, the veto rights in the United Nations, and the sort of it's 800-pound gorilla, so that could affect everybody in the forest or in the jungle. That's I know it was always a popular theme in America, and now you could hear it, both from the right and the left, that, okay, we're just far away. It's Iraq, Syria, Russia, Ukraine, who cares? We have our problems. Let's solve these problems. We still have two giant oceans dividing us from these problems. For those who, keep repeating this even in 21st century, I can tell them that in 1941, Japan was far away. In 2001, Al-Qaeda training camps were really far away. But when you look at this, at this progress of technology, you could see that it took Japan several months of preparation and the entire fleet to kill 2,400 Americans. It took 19 foreigners to cross Atlantic in the commercial jets and to kill more than 3,000 Americans. Today, they don't even have to cross the oceans. They could do damage from their cellars, using the modern technologies. The world is different. The whole world is interdependent. It's global. And if we enjoy global trade, global business, global finance, social networks, cultural exchange, we should recognize that these tools are not just made to make our lives better only because they could be used by bad guys to make our lives miserable or even just to go after us. And unfortunately, they're quite sophisticated in doing so because they don't have to follow any rules, and it's much easier to destroy than to build. So no one is safe. And while in my lectures and in my previous book, Life Imitates Chess, I argued for the attacker's advantage. That's the way I play chess. I can tell you that in the modern world, in the modern geopolitics, defense is a losing proposition. You can't be on the defensive. So just why you have to think about Putin and other thugs and dictators and terrorists, because the only way for them to stay in power and to find a rationale for staying in power forever is to create enemies. And of course, America will be always the number one enemy for all of them, because for a dictator to look strong, powerful enemies needed. So that's why for Putin, creating America as an existential enemy for Russia, it's paramount for selling his case to the Russian public.
You mentioned in the book a number of times. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the engagement process that the Bush administration and the Obama administration have done, which you were very critical of in the book. I did notice also in the book you referenced, interestingly enough, you referenced The Godfather a number of times, and you were comparing very overtly. You were comparing Putin to Don Corleone in terms of the money and the amassing of power and loyalty and all those factors. There is, however, another. There is a Godfather line I remember from the second Godfather movie, probably because I've seen it too many times, where Michael Corleone says, keep your friends close but your enemies closer. And could it not be said that what the Obama administration, even what the Bush administration, have been trying to do with engagement would be to try to, that they don't necessarily trust the Russians too, but that it's better to try to keep them close through engagement?
Look, we can discuss different strategies, but I believe, as once Winston Churchill said, no matter how beautiful the strategy, you have occasionally check the results. Now, I'm not arguing, for just, sending troops all over the place, and starting wars. I believe diplomacy is the first option. It's second option. Maybe it's the third option. But diplomacy cannot be the only option. Because the moment you remove other options from the table, the bad guys, take these concessions for granted and move on, demanding more. It's the most, it's infamous case in world history. It's of course in 1938 when Neville Chamberlain followed the demand of British public to avoid the war at any cost, and he did avoid the war for 11 months, and was forced to start the war, actually to declare the war. Few people remember that it was not Winston Churchill who declared war on Hitler, but Chamberlain. And, what's happened is that from the Hitler's perspective, what was the difference? They gave up Czechoslovakia, why not to take Poland? So what was the difference? It's just Eastern Europe. Why the Brits or French? Why they cared at all? So making all these concessions, led to the situation where these guys, like Putin or Iranian mullahs or others, they just believed that they could do literally whatever. Speaking about the Iranian, nuclear problem is in the book. Actually, to my surprise, I discovered that the first time this issue was raised between Russian and American presidents was 20 years ago. Bill Clinton raised this issue with Boris Yeltsin, and nothing happened because he thought it was not that important, and we could just wait and see what happens later on. Okay, we are now in 2015, and. At one point, I could justify this behavior, though I thought that from the very first day of Putin's in office, you could see the signs on the wall. The first thing he did, he restored Soviet anthem. It's okay, it's a symbol, some say. Who cares? No. It's Freudist reaction. So he was thinking about it. Not that he had power at that time, not that he had resources at that time to move on with this plan of restoring Soviet empire, Soviet influence, but it was in his blood. And he also said, no former KGB officers, once KGB, forever KGB. That's he said. And he many times said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster. Why not simply reading what he said? Many people didn't want to read Mein Kampf because they said, no, he didn't mean that. No, he did. And Putin meant it. So just read what he said. What happened with Crimea, what's happened with Eastern Ukraine, what's happened in Syria could be predicted because in 2008, Putin already invaded a tiny republic of Georgia. And instead of any punishment, he was offered a reset policy by newly sworn President Barack Obama and his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. I remember this when newly appointed ambassador in Moscow, Mike McFaul, has been talking to us, me, Boris Nemtsov, and other members of Russian opposition, about Americans' plans to put their weight behind Medvedev. What? Medvedev? I couldn't believe my ears. Anybody in his or her mind could really believe that Medvedev could be an opposition to Putin? It was a shadow. And we have to give Putin credit, as a savvy KGB officer who could read psychology of people surrounding him and also the opposition from the free world. And he could pick up someone who stayed in power, technically stayed in power for 4 years and did absolutely nothing to hurt Putin. Even moreover, gave it back to Putin, extending the term to 6 years. And what also bothers me when I hear time and again that Putin played great chess. Geopolitical chess. He plays chess, Obama plays checkers. Come on, it's just this, I have to defend the integrity of my game. In chess, it's all transparent. You can see what's happening on the board. It's about, long-term strategy. So you just, you play by the rules. I remember when I stopped, my professional career and moved into what people mistakenly call Russian politics. Yeah. And the first question was whether I believed that my chess experience could help me with navigating in this rough waters of Russian politics. My answer was absolutely not, because in chess we have fixed rules and unpredictable results. In Putin's Russia, it's exactly the opposite. Now, going back to Putin, the chess player, it's not chess, it's poker. it's a geopolitical poker, and he's quite good in that. In poker, you don't have to dominate with your cards. You can have a very weak hand, but you can bluff. And again, let's give him credit. He's very good in bluffing. When, when Obama walked away from his infamous red line that he drawn in Syria 2 years ago, I said it was just it was psychological defeat. Because Putin played with a very weak hand, pair of 6, you name it. But he acted as if he had a royal flush. And Obama had a full house, and he flashed it in the toilet. So Putin believes that, no matter how weak is his hand, he can always raise the stakes. And Obama, Europeans, they all will fold out their cards. So someone has to call the bluff, because otherwise he will keep raising the stakes. And, it's one day you will find him elsewhere, not only in Syria, though I think it's dangerous enough, because that's one of the most explosive regions in the world. And Putin recognized immediately that he could do a lot of damage to the world order, because destroying the world order, creating chaos, is his best chance to stay in power. He needs muddy waters. Otherwise, why is he there for 15 years? So what is the message to the Russian public? Economy is in terrible shape, living standards have been deteriorating. So why they have to support Putin? Because Russia is the fortress of goods surrounded by the global evil. And Putin is a white knight who's protecting Mother Russia against Americans, of course Jews, that's traditional menu. And now Ukrainians, Estonians, Georgians, and like Soviet Union, the menu of enemies have increased quite dramatically. So conflict is something that feeds Putin's domestic agenda. Whatever he does, in Crimea, in eastern Ukraine, in Syria, next stop maybe Benghazi. So it's all aimed at creating the right image at home. So I wonder whether there are more Russian TV crews in Syria than military men. Because you can see phenomenal pictures, from there, from bombs being dropped. It's an image. It's a nice image. It shows that Putin is doing something dramatic. Of course, he's not bombing Islamic State. He's bombing American-backed rebels. But, the picture is phenomenal. And I remember when Putin went to New York, to the General Assembly of United Nations, to deliver his speech. I knew from the beginning it was not about the speech. It was about him meeting Obama. And you remember this reluctant handshake? I bet you he spent a few hours in front of the mirror practicing this. Just because this is the picture that was on Russian television. Putin had no choice. He had to go to the belly of the beast, to New York. Met Obama, had to shake his hand. Next day, Russian planes bombed American-backed rebels in Syria. As a combined picture shows that Putin thinks about defending interests of Russia and, hurting America, because America, sometimes we have to negotiate with them, but of course it's an enemy. So Putin knows about the power of these images, and he knows that the one thing dictator cannot afford is to look weak. The moment he is weak, and that brings us back to mafia. If the boss of bosses shows weakness, he can expect some people behind him think about his invincibility.
Well, you mentioned before you were talking about Hitler and Chamberlain. There's a lot in the book about that. You're probably well aware. In fact, you acknowledge in the book also. This is a quote from the book. I'm very aware of the dangers of comparing anything bad to Nazis and Hitler. And I'm sure you've been in America long enough to know that when you invoke Hitler comparisons in virtually any context here, a lot of people kind of shut down their listening, because it's like it just sounds so over the top. So do you feel that you break through that? I mean, I think people have bears when they hear that. There might be people in this room, for example, who voted for Obama, who might not necessarily welcome the notion that Obama is on a plane with Neville Chamberlain. And, and you evoked Neville Chamberlain.
No, he's
before.
not. Neville Chamberlain doesn't have did have history book to read what happens next.
So in that sense, he is as bad as Neville Chamberlain then, right?
Yeah, it's the... I appeal to people's intellect because, it's easy to say Hitler is absolute evil, and it is from the history books. But we should remember there was Hitler in 1933, in 1934, in 1935, in 1936, in 1937, in 1938. And before it turned into 39, 40, 41, and just all the way to 1945, there were many moments where he could be stopped. In 1936, instead of sending teams to the Berlin Olympiad, France and Britain could send troops to support legitimate Republican government in Spain that has been attacked not only by Franco rebels, but also by Italians, troops, and German planes. And at the time when everybody celebrated the Olympic Games in Berlin, German planes, the Legion Condor, bombed Spanish cities. That would be the lesson. And there were many other opportunities. Again, Hitler has been gaining confidence and arrogance by seeing the weakness all over the place. And we know from Churchill's memoirs and from many other Western historians that even in 1938, many German generals thought if Hitler would go too far, it's time to rise. But after seeing Chamberlain giving up everything, same as, maybe a Russian general seeing that Putin received Crimea and other, concessions without a single shot made. How can you attack a dictator who is lucky and invincible and is being able to negotiate great deals with the most powerful leaders in the world?
Okay, so if America needs a whole new way of handling Putin, we have to talk a little bit about the Republican and Democratic primaries. And I think I read somewhere that you were trying to time this book for the beginning of the campaign season. All right, so we've had debates. Russia's come up, sporadically here and there. And let's just go one party. Let's go Democrats first, okay? So have you been encouraged by the fact that Hillary Clinton was talking about establishing a no-fly zone in Syria, at least to try to get our toe in the water as a way to sort of push back? Is that an encouraging sign to you, or do you take that as
before we try
nothing?
to look at both parties, and just go through the candidates, I would say that my idea from the very beginning was to actually encourage these debates, because I believe the way to move forward is to recreate the bipartisan foreign policy that helped America to win the Cold War. You had great presidents on both sides. You had Harry Truman and Ronald Reagan. You had JFK. So it was not about party. It was more about, just individuals. And, you had equal contribution from both parties to make sure that the Cold War was won and the evil empire has been destroyed. And now, ironically, by the way, you hear from both parties, from right and left, the theme of isolationism. And so let's move away. And I just hope that the final debate between the nominees from Democrats and from GOP will be concentrating on more on the methods of dealing with Putin, with other threats in the world that we just touch down just briefly in this conversation, rather than about philosophy itself. And the fact is that Hillary Clinton spoke about this as encouraging, though, she should still, exonerate herself from the reset policy that she initiated as a Secretary of State, which I think was a huge mistake that gave Putin a lot of encouragement to move forward with his clandestine agenda.
I'm sort of suspecting that she might want to go further now than what she said, but she doesn't want to risk making look like she's
that's why
with Obama.
Yeah, but I think it's just as long as she's fighting the primary in the primaries, definitely she will try to be more cautious. But as a presumed nominee, I think she will be far more hawkish than she's now.
Well, here's one of the interesting things about the Republicans that I noticed. And I noticed this when Russia came up at the last debate, that within the Republican Party, we've sort of had a bit of a split. We have Marco Rubio, just to mention a few people, has been very sort of more in sort of what you would consider to be sort of an appropriately hawkish position toward Russia. But Donald Trump, who until this week was a front runner and still may be, Donald Trump was the one who came out and said, I would get along very well with Putin. That's a quote. Did you hear that, and what did you think?
Oh, I did. Yeah, you bet. And this is I remember when Donald Trump made his terrible comments about Senator McCain and about POWs. I immediately responded to my Twitter saying that's I heard it already. So there are no prisoners of war and only traitors. Joseph Stalin. By the way, Justice. And as for Donald Trump, so I called him a cotton candy candidate. It's
that's what Twitter's good for.
Yeah, at first it tastes good, no nutritional value. and too much makes you sick.
Can you fit all that into Twitter? I didn't know you could.
Look, I have my strong views. By the way, I said a problem on Fox TV, so that's why I go anywhere. So this is, I could be on one side or another. I want to see it, and it's the new philosophy, or actually it's old new philosophy, adopted by both parties, and stop arguing about minor details and concentrating on the big picture and real threats that America is facing and will be facing. So as for other Republican candidates, yes, I heard a few strong statements. I liked most what was said by Marco Rubio, because I understand it's as Cuban. I mean, he knows better than others. It's like, on genetic level. So that's dictator. So he believes in what he says. Sometimes, you can hear people saying things, but it's more for the statement. I think for Rubio was natural. And again, my interest to help this debate to be elevated to a level where, it could end up with a proper policy, because that's what is required. America cannot lead from behind. If America doesn't lead, the world will be in chaos. Some people don't like, America being what they call world policemen, but you know what happens when policeman is not on the beat. And it's whether you like it or not, these threats are real and they require American involvement, not necessarily boots on the ground, but strong policy combining different methods.
Okay, so without getting too much into the weeds of policy, what 2 or 3 steps do you think that America should be taking when you talk about being more muscular about Putin, that it has not taken so far? What would you say? 1, 2, 3.
Okay, it's as I said, the Cold War is not necessarily of using your troops. It's about psychology. It's about your credibility. Unfortunately, the credibility of the presidential office has been ruined over the last few years. Actually, probably over the last 50 years, because it's you can overdo things, you do nothing, and both are bad. So it's now. I think it's when Putin attacked Ukraine and invaded Crimea and moved to eastern Ukraine. I believe that the best thing America could do, without sending troops, or just even without sending weapons to Ukraine, which I believe was very important, not only militarily but psychologically, simply to send one of the American warships to Odessa with a friendly visit. You just stay there. It's very important for Russian generals to actually see in binoculars that there's an American flag there. You can shoot, but it's American flag, it's American tank, it's American warship. You have to create different, very uncomfortable psychological conditions for those who probably, at one point will have to follow crazy orders from Vladimir Putin. Forget Putin, forget his inner circle. But any dictator needs generals, colonels, majors to carry his aggressive plans. They have to feel uncomfortable, understand that this is a war that they cannot lose. No military, no officer would like to be engaged in a war that is lost from the very beginning. Right now, they don't feel any real threat, so that's why they can go anywhere Putin sends them. Then, of course, sanctions. Come on, yes, it's better than nothing, but sanctions are pretty weak. Because you have a Russian oligarch who is just probably, denied his visa, he's stuck in Moscow, but as long as his wife or other relatives can run his fortunes, his companies in Switzerland or London, he doesn't care very much. Okay? It's inconvenience. But inconvenience is not a powerful incentive to push him against Putin. Because you go against Putin today and you're dead if you miss. And most likely, Putin is too strong. But you have to weaken Putin, domestically by demonstrating for Russian elite, also for Russian middle class, that there is a price. Mm-hmm. The price for Crimea, the price for Eastern Ukraine, the price for everything. So far, people have been suffering, but they believe Putin eventually could prevail by turning the table around. Okay, maybe 6 more months, maybe 12 more months, but eventually Putin will have his way. And if you read, I'm not even talking about Channel 1 or just, the main stream Putin's propaganda, but when you look at the websites like Rosbusiness Consulting, those websites and media that aimed at, more sort of intelligent and more advanced Russian audience, you read news like Europe divided on the sanctions. So, and they always have news, just to encourage people to believe that Putin has under control. It's temporarily. Just, please, wait. Putin will fix it. If people in Russia realize that Putin cannot fix it and Putin is not a solution but a problem, then, as we know from history, something happens.
I'm going to ask one last question, then we're going to go in just 2 minutes to audience questions. So if anybody is thinking and getting ready, we're going to have microphones in a second. I just wanted to ask one last thing because I'm curious. The name of the book is Winter is Coming, which to me, as I understand, you're a Game of Thrones fan,
yes.
And that's a line from Game of Thrones. So I understand and I read somewhere that you've compared Putin to Tywin Lannister.
Now, I was forced to give an example, So
yeah, right. So you were.
Let's just now tell us, I had no intention of comparing Putin to any
fictional character.
Yeah, fictional character. And the reason I picked this as title, and by the way, it doesn't happen now. The publisher grabs this title because they always come up with other ideas. Because what I wanted is to show that history it's cyclical. It goes in seasons, and somehow it's a delayed debate with Francis Fukuyama. So I was very proud when he just agreed to donate a blurb to the book, because it was not his mistake when he wrote End of History. It was everybody's mistake. We all believed that it was, wow, it's time to celebrate. Soviet Union collapsed, liberal democracy has won. So End of History, it was the mood of all people who believed in free market, in liberal democracy in early 90s. But whether we like it or not, it's not linear, it's cyclical. And it's a different season. So I thought about, it's warning people about, this new geopolitical winter. It was totally the best title I could find, and I always say, you shouldn't, criticize me too heavily because I'm a weatherman. So I'm trying to give you an, accurate forecast, and just following another popular topic, I could say that, that's in geopolitical climate. I mean, we definitely want global warming.
Well, we don't want to go too heavily into the Tywin Lannister comparison because if I remember correctly, he was killed on a toilet. If I remember correctly,
by the way,
HBO,
this is
right?
it's the good thing about dictators, that's they don't know what happens to them. But I can bet you that Putin will not die from biological reasons.
Oh wow! All right, well, that's a great way to segue. We have microphones here, so why don't we go right there, and then we'll come right back over on this side.
Thank you for coming to Philadelphia. My question is, what does Putin think about China? I don't read too much about Sino-Soviet relations in the press these days. What's going on in his mind, do you think?
Wow, I mean, you assume I can read his mind. I wish I could. Now, if I could judge from body language, it's very different. The moment he talks to Chinese, it's very different, from the moment he speaks to Obama or Merkel. I mean, he knows that Chinese they don't buy it. So, and he's, China is too powerful, and we say in Russia that Chinese leadership thinks in centuries and Russian in dollars. So, Putin has been desperately trying to sort of pretend that Russia had an alternative of trade, doing trade with China, building relations with China. Come on, I mean, China is too big, and China loves it because they could see Putin, offering them everything, the gas, oil at all discounted prices, and basically doing nothing to stop crawling Chinese invasion. I remember I was traveling in the Russian Far East and East Siberia 10 years ago, and in Irkutsk I heard a very sad joke from locals that Chinese have been crossing our borders in very small groups, 100,000 each. It's also another, when people, talked about possible Putin's attacks after Crimea, and of course many, thought about northern Kazakhstan. That's by many Russians, considered to be part of Russia, and it's populated by its Russian majority there, and definitely Kazakhstan, has no means to defend it. And I said, no way, because if Putin sends his polite green man to Kazakhstan, he will meet their impolite yellow man. So Putin knows that this is a Chinese sphere of influence, and so he cannot touch it. So it's unfortunately it's a one-way street, and I think that the real threat to territorial integrity of Russia comes from China. Of course, we have problems in the south with radical Islam, because in both cases we have demographic situation that is working against Russian strategic interest.
Over on this side someplace, down there. Right there on the aisle, yeah.
Прежде всего, спасибо большое, что приехали, Гарри Кимович. I want to ask you about Russian economy. Now it's like sounds like it was the end of Soviet Union. So is there a chance modern Russia will collapse because of economic reasons, not because of like sanctions or like this?
No, I would say sanctions are somewhat connected to the economic problems. And it's not only sanctions imposed by America and Europe, but also counter-sanctions imposed by Putin on European and American goods and food. From what I can gather, the information that I'm reading from Russian press, it doesn't look good. So as the latest comment from the Minister of Finance in Russia, that's Russia, the reserves, the so-called reserve fund, will be wasted by the end of 2016. So, okay, maybe he's just warning Putin. We don't know. It's maybe the way to send a signal. But what we could see now, and it's the budget that has been just passed lately. It's a budget of war, because despite all these economic problems, Putin keeps spending money on military, security apparatus, and propaganda. Those are the three biggest, items in Putin's agenda. I mean, you don't create such a budget unless you are expecting, a major crisis, and you don't care about what your economy. Oil 50 or just slightly below. I would say probably year to 2 years. That's then when Putin's regime will run out of money. But if oil goes below, I think it could get crazy, and we can expect, dramatic actions. I think that if oil goes to 20, he could cross NATO border, because he will be desperate. He'll run out of money. So I think that it's important to think about, it's the way of confronting him before it happens, and addressing these issues, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, just to Russian middle class and Russian oligarchs and Russian military in a very subtle way, just explaining to them that they should leave as soon as they can the thinking ship of Putin. That's the only sound policy.
Let's go back someplace halfway back there. Right there.
So Stalin was another evil leader in Russia that we managed to work with to fight against Hitler. Can you comment on the possibility of working with Putin and the Iranians against ISIS and other evils in that area?
No, I think it's just, at that time, you definitely, had no choice but to work with Stalin, because Hitler was a much bigger threat. And this is, if he could crush Soviet Union, he would definitely move west. And let's not forget that immediately after the end of the World War II, so the West had no choice also but to build institutions for resisting Soviet aggression, because Stalin had big appetite. The situation today is quite different, because unlike in the 30s or 40s or even in the 50s or 60s, the free world has an overwhelming advantage economically, militarily, and if you want to make an alliance with someone, and I agree, sometimes maybe you have to make an alliance with bad guys, just to fight even those who are even worse. The problem is that their interest is exactly the opposite. So they have no interest in confronting ISIS. 90% plus of Russian bombs dropped in Syria are not hitting ISIS, but American-backed rebels. You can't say it's the mistakes. They're 90% plus mistakes, 93% to be precise. Yeah, and they had pretty good, list of targets given by Assad. Iranians, they have also different interests there, because both Iranians and Putin, they need to push oil prices up. So how you do that? You need to create a major crisis in the area, And ideally, you have to engage Saudi Arabia. Because as long as Saudi Arabia can pump oil, in these quantities, it's hard to expect that the oil price could go up, because you have, between Saudis and American shale oil, there will be enough oil in the market. But if Saudi Arabia blows up, things could change. Now, remember, Islamic State, they're Sunnis. And basically we're seeing now the Sunnis versus Shia war. It's a sectarian religious war with, Assad's Alawites, on the side. I believe Putin's dream is to push Islamic State south, because Sunnis to Saudis could find its home in Saudi Arabia. There are many Sunnis there. So it could be even more radical ideology that could confront Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia. That could change dramatically everything. So that's why expecting them to help you is just, it's against the experience that we have accumulated by dealing with these guys. Because they need chaos, they need conflicts. Putin can't afford stable Middle East, because then the oil prices will never go up, and he'll run out of money. So for him, it's a matter of survival. So that's why I think you have to find other ways of dealing with this problem. And let's not also forget, Israel is very close. So there are too many ways of engaging Israel in this mess, and then it could be, the whole region will be in flames.
Let's go way up back. Somebody back there. I see 3 hands. 4.
What do you think Putin is hoping for from the American population or public? And what do you think is our best counter to his hopes or his moves?
I think Putin is quite happy that, that America is where America is now, because it's, as long as we have a Secretary of State who publicly concedes every position, it's always quite amazing to see Kerry and Lavrov meeting, and Kerry always tells Lavrov in public what America is not going to do, which is quite odd in negotiations. So I even once, made a joke on my Twitter saying that you can't afford to leave Kerry with Lavrov for too long, because in a week time he'll give him Alaska back.
I got to start reading your Twitter.
I mean, we know that boots on the ground is not an option, but why to say that? I want even to shout, keep your mouth shut, so this is, don't say that. Don't say it's not personal. No, it is personal, all the sanctions. Don't, make them feel comfortable. So Putin knows America is there, but right now it doesn't have the credibility it had before, and he also knows that whoever wins the White House in November 2016, it will be different foreign policy. It's whether Hillary or a GOP nominee, they will play a different ball game. So, which makes me feel scared, because if he has this 12 months window or the 13 months window, who knows what he can do? I mean, he's already in Syria, and there's so many other weak spots on the map, and it's hopefully we'll not find him again in Cuba, but he could go anywhere.
Let's go over somebody on this side.
So I have a good friend who grew up in Russia, and who I now work with. And on a long plane ride, I said, "So Sergei, what do you think about Russia?" And he said, "Great country, just don't ask me to live there." And I was struck that many of your comments were anti-Putin. Yet, when you talked about Russia, you sometimes used the pronoun "we." How do you, if it's not too personal, how do you think about Russia yourself? And what's your dream for your homeland?
Look, yeah, there are people who think Russia is Putin or Stalin. For me, Russia is Sakharov, and I could start counting many great names. I've been playing on the Soviet flag and the Russian flag for 25 years. I'm probably the most decorated Soviet and Russian athlete in history. I grew up in what I call Russian Empire, so I don't have Russian blood in me, ethnically. My mother is Armenian, father is Jewish, but I grew up in Russian culture. Russian is my native tongue. I could, trust me, I could speak Russian much better than Putin. Yeah, set aside writing. In 2005, when I stopped my professional chess career, I moved into Russian, again, politics. But it was a very different game for me because I knew it was not about winning or losing. It was just like a moral imperative. I wanted just to do whatever I could to prevent Russia from sliding back to the dictatorship. I was not successful. As a result, I had to leave Russia, and I'm resigning in New York now. My mother is still there, and that's quite painful because, when my father died, she dedicated her life to me. She's 78, and we could meet occasionally in Estonia, in Croatia, elsewhere. But she also recognized that, there was no other choice. It's something that you should do. When I was a kid, 9 or 10, she put on top of my bed the motto, "If not you, who else?" So for me, it's like my moral duty, and we have occasionally conversations in our family. My wife is sometimes scared because people who are criticizing Putin, they could be in big trouble. But I do what I believe I have to do, and I also believe that sooner or later I'll return, because I'm probably an uncured optimist by nature, and I think that Russia cannot disappear from the map. It may be smaller in size because we can lose some territories, but eventually Russia will play a role. It could be a negative role, it could be a positive role, but it will be a very important role to define the future of mankind. And I will be always available to offer my experience, my skills, my intellectual qualities to help Russia to move in the right direction.
Yes, sir, right here. Here's your microphone.
So the Middle East is a mess right now.
It is.
Putin aside, as a Russian, how would you like to see Middle East shape up?
Oh, I'm an intellectual fan of the theory that most of the problems we have been dealing with these days or dealt before in 20th century resulted from World War I. So that World War I actually shaped history for more than 100 years. It definitely led to the World War II and, many other problems, like, for instance, collapse of Yugoslavia. So it's a bloody collapse or peaceful divorce of Czechs and Slovaks. So there were results of the World War I post-World War I negotiations and maps created by the victorious allies. Now, in the Middle East, we're seeing similar situation because all these states, if you look at the map of the 1920, they were quite artificial. So you look at the map of Iraq of 1920, and you could see exactly the Sunnis in the middle, Shia on the east, and the little Turkish enclave, and then Alawites on the west. So I think we have to recognize that, the territorial integrity in this region probably could be, you can't do it unilaterally, but you have to find a solution. Because there's no way you can put together, Sunnis and Shias in Iraq in one state. So you just have to come up with some solutions that will guarantee that we'll end this war and mass killings, and we'll come up with some kind of, stable arrangements. We have 30 million Kurds living there without a state. That's a recipe for disaster because they will always, revolt against Iranians, against Iraqis, against Turks. So we just have to start looking for, for new arrangements in the 21st century. And I think the Middle East is one of the places where you just, you have to do something to make sure that, this sectarian and religious and ethnic wars will not last forever.
We have not hit the back on this side, so I see a bunch of hands up there.
We've seen recently, in the last year or two especially, a very serious curtailing of the free business and free industry in Russia, the seizing of property and seizing of company and stuff. Do you think there's any chance that Putin will be forced to allow a resurgence or a rebirth of private industry in Russia, even foreign business, because of a seriously collapsing economy? Do you think that's something that might happen, or would he never allow that?
The Putin's game is now is all about staying in power. So that's why he has to create a power structure that will be loyal to him. And when you build such a structure, you have to accept the fact that every element of the structure, from top to the bottom, also has its own structure. And you cannot stop the mayor that you appointed or a head of the district appointed by this mayor to go after local businesses, because they all must have their fair share. Otherwise, why they are loyal to the boss? So it's like a state racket, So it's a mafia structure, and things could get only worse, because in order to have private business functioning again, so you need not only the government protecting their interest and offering them sort of tax breaks or other incentives, but you need the legal system. You need courts that could protect the property against illegal seizure. And in Russia, things just since the beginning of Putin's rule, especially the Yukos case, it's all going just downhill, and things could get only worse.
Two hands in the middle. I couldn't overlook two hands.
And by the way, just before the mic is just reached its destination.
We have to have the middle of the road.
I always said that corruption in Russia was not a problem. Corruption in Putin's Russia is a system.
My question is, what does the future hold? Who is possible after Putin? However Putin goes out of power, do you see opposition that could step in afterwards? What are your hopes for post-Putin?
Look, if I knew the person who could replace Putin, this person most likely would be dead. Yeah, it's the dictators. They succeed in staying in power for so long because they have eliminated opposition, any seed of opposition. It's longer dictator stays in power, more he turns his country into political desert. And who can survive in the desert? Quite, dangerous animals. Very few of them, like snakes or rats. So I'm not telling you that the end of Putin, which will be abrupt, most likely violent, will bring Russia to a democracy. No, it was quite naive for Americans to believe that the end of Gaddafi's regime could lead to an immediate democracy in Libya. 42 years of repression. So what could you expect? So all I know is that the longer Putin stays in power, it's the higher the price will pay. So that's why sooner it happens better. Though again, there's no guarantee there will be positive outcome. My hope is that there are so many Russians, we're talking about probably hundreds of thousands, who are now abroad. It's especially young Russians who are educated in the foreign universities. And, when the moment comes, the new Russian, you may call it government, whoever will be in charge will have an opportunity to replace the corrupt Putin's vertical of power by the new blood, by those who had a very different education and different values.
We have time for one more question. I see so many hands, so I feel terrible. Oh, another two-hander over here. So we have to go with enthusiasm, right there.
Yeah.
In the 1990s, the criminal element in Russia was very public, and it was a very frightening situation. And it has been less public, or at least in my experience, it has been less public in these days. Is it that Putin has crushed, to a certain extent, the public criminal element, or has it changed its face?
Corruption in Russia is today is probably 10 times that it was in the 1990s. If you remember, former Prime Minister Mikhail Kasyanov was called Misha 2%. I mean, this is now nobody talks about less than 20%. Yeah. So, yes, you may say that Russian business is no longer controlled by criminals, but it's controlled by the criminals who are, just wearing KGB uniform. So it didn't change much, but it made it even worse because, at that time there was plenty of enthusiasm. There was just huge expectations that, okay, maybe it's, these difficulties, they're temporary, and this is tomorrow, in a year or two, we'll have, a new different country. Today, the brain drain. You look at the number of Russians that would like to emigrate. So in the 90s, we didn't have, so many Russians trying to leave the country. It's on one side you have the reports of more and more Russians supporting Putin, and on the other side you have more and more Russians that would like to emigrate. So tell me, when the same Russians are, more sincere. So the myth of 90s, was the myth of, just that has been, has worked out for Putin's propaganda. And again, I'm not trying to tell you that they were great years, and I'm quite critical about Yeltsin in my book. But again, there was a hope. It was the democracy was it was a feeble foundation for democracy, but it could turn into something tangible. It didn't. It hasn't.
I'm just going to ask you one last quick thing. It's a follow-up to a couple things that you've touched on, which is, the risks of speaking out. And you've lost some friends, and you've acknowledged that, and you've written about that. Do you ever think that way about? Do you have security? You're in New York. Do you feel safe?
Safety is a relative thing. Yes, in New York, I face in the, I want to say in police, but I would rather say it's being in the United States. It's the best security I could hope for. I'm not visiting countries where I believe my life could be in danger, or I could be extradited back to Russia. I don't drink tea with strangers. And
good line from your book.
And I believe that the only good thing about my hectic schedule, because I'm hitting the road all the time, is that there's no routine. It offers little comfort to my family, but look, you mentioned my friends. I lost quite a few, but Boris Nemtsov, and I dedicate the book to him and to others who are fighting for freedom the way he did. You can hardly imagine me speechless, and I was for 20 minutes when I heard this news, from Moscow, being in New York. And look, and I left Russia because of his advice. He told me after there was a request from Russian investigative committee to visit them and to talk about numerous political cases that they opened at that time. And Boris said, don't come back. You enter the building as a witness, and if you leave the building, most likely as a suspect. So I left Russia, and I wish he could do the same, because we all knew he was in danger, but he was too proud. He was a man who was imposing presence, the man who was once the deputy prime minister, and many believed Yeltsin's successor. Just sometimes, going to bed, I think, what could happen in Russia if Yeltsin selected Nemtsov over Putin? He hasn't, and he was gunned down in front of Kremlin. When people ask me about opposition in Russia, come on, it's just 4 bullets. And by the way, we still have no idea who did it. That's just in front of Kremlin, 150 meters, from Kremlin walls. Try to make, just in the middle of a day, try to make, a report with a camera there. You will be approached in 30 seconds. And it's just, he was gunned down. There are more cameras there than Fort Knox. And they still don't know who did it. And so I do it for him, I do it for many others. And as I mentioned, Andrei Sakharov, I was privileged to meet him in the last year of his life. You know, all we can do is this is one man, you know, I can speak out. I mean, I don't have oil wells, I don't have corporations, I don't have money. Okay, some money just to support my family, but not to fight this regime. But there are certain principles that, you know, that's we have to protect, and Boris died for them. And there are many others. This is the tip of the iceberg. Many others who were either killed or just behind bars or now in forced exile. And you know, hopefully one day we can come back, and one day Russia will recover. You know, its better side.
Well, we applaud your work. We wish you long life and great health.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.